Okay, so recently in the news has been a lot about Kanye West and the things he has said. He's not new to racism uh, and saying the most horrific things about other Black people, Black and Brown people. And now he has really come out with a lot of anti Semitic rhetoric. Even though I saw he sort of apologized, but it wasn't really an apology. Now, we know the history with the Jewish people, what they've been through, and anyone who's been paying attention knows that it never really ended. The anti-Semitism, the um, and just white supremacy in general never ended. And it's been inflamed and it's been so much worse uh, over the past, what is it now? 6, 7 years. And it's something that we don't talk about enough. I realized a while back that I don't talk about it enough. And I spoke to a friend who was Jewish about it, and she didn't talk about it much. And I found that the reason is fear. And it really opened my eyes to, just like white people need to use their voice for Black and Brown people, we also, and everybody should be using their voice for each other, but we also need to use our voice against anti Semitism. And so this month, I am going to be talking about this topic and talking about the roots of some of the beliefs that have really taken hold in both the New Age communities and that have already been part of religious communities for a long time, and what have taken hold in the alt right, the far right, the whatever we want to call it, really just at this point, the right. Um, and especially like QAnon, like really these views. And I never, when I was in the New Age spirituality communities, groups, I never believed the um, conspiracy theories that people were sharing that I now know to be deeply anti Semitic. And I'm relieved because there's so many things that I did believe in and was part of that are very privileged, are even racist, which I now know, and didn't see then, didn't know because I never looked at the origins. And that's what I'm here to do, is to help people by telling people where these beliefs come from, where they originated, what they're based in, so that you can decide if what side of this you want to be on. If you want to believe something that is rooted in racism or anti-Semitism, one and the same, or you want to see the harm it can do. And so we're going to start today by talking about the origins of one of these theories. And so I actually, in my reading and research, I came across the word conspiracy fantasy and how it is a much more accurate term than the more commonly used conspiracy theory. Because conspiracy fantasy just sounds more likely. Theories may be true, but fantasy is usually based in something different. So I'm going to get into where this is all based, this specific topic. And it's historically been associated with authoritarian political movements. Conspiracy fantasy is one of the two defining themes of anti-Semitism. The idea that there are these elites, right? We hear that a lot. We hear that is a word that is thrown around a lot by both people who are deeply entrenched in spirituality and some religious groups and the far right. And so this talk of the elites, when we think about it, and even when I would hear about it, I would just think it meant the rich people, right? But it doesn't. And the people who spread this information, and a lot of the people who actually know, and I'll get to somebody who's been posting a lot lately about this, know that it's anti-Semitic. So the elites were historically Jewish people. And part of this conspiracy fantasy was that these elites who were Jewish consumed children's blood, specifically Christian children. So this was heavily based in both racism and religion, like a way to spread that one religion and race, because Jewish is both a religion, a culture, a race. And so the story was that the elites control global events in order to enslave the global population, which is also known as the New World Order. Now, I remember hearing New World Order when I was like a kid or teenager in like the 80s and 90s. And I never knew where that came from. But so whenever you hear about the elites, it is based in trying to discredit and trying to vilify Jewish people. And it has taken on a life of its own. Now it's conveniently, it is Jewish people at the top, and then it is Democrats, right? And so now they've mixed it up. It's not just Jewish people, but it is still heavily based in anti-Semitism. Now, where did this originate? So the first religious movement to take on the ideologies surrounding anti-Semitic conspiracy fantasies was British Israelism, which was started by John Wilson. And this goes back to the 1800s. The movement was supposed to empower Christians by claiming that they were the true descendants of the lost tribes of Israel, not the Jewish people. And then one of Wilson's followers and mentees, Edward Hine, began to share more radical anti Semitic theories as well. And so we'll get to those in a moment. What else was going on is that there was I guess, a book that was called The Protocols of Elders of Zion, which is still the most widely distributed anti Semitic population. It is a propaganda and plagiarized piece that is complete fiction, written with the intent to make people believe that Jews are to blame for a large number of problems. The protocols were first published in Russia in 1905. It was an appendix to a piece called The Great in the Small, The Coming of the Antichrist and Rule of Satan on Earth, written by a Russian writer and mystic, Sergei Nilis. And so you can already see that politics, anti-Semitism, and mysticism, the bridge between them, the connection, the Venn diagram has been there. This isn't new. So when people are shocked that spiritual people went all the way to like QAnon, there were like people who everybody considered, like crunchy moms were considered the, liberal moms. And people are like, how did they get to QAnon, and there's always been this pipeline. So it's nothing new. Now, the protocols are basically intended to show that Jewish people rule the world and that they do it by manipulating the economy, controlling the media, and creating religious conflict. Now, does this sound familiar to anyone? Because this is exactly what has been a bunch of talking points by people in spiritual circles and wellness circles, in far right, QAnon, Trump circles and communities. So Edward Hine, we'll go back to him. His ideas, his anti-Semitic ideas, came to the US in the 20th century. Christian identifying groups started to believe that they were the true Israelites. And then the protocols made it to the States, and an American version was created. These beliefs were purported by the most popular of the movements, called the John Birch Society. Now, I'm going to come back to that in a minute. I want to talk about the protocols a little bit more. The London Times showed proof in 1921 that the protocols were copied in large part from a piece of French political satire that actually never even mentioned Jewish people. So they plagiarized that work of satire and added in what they wanted, which was to demonize Jewish people. Now, did that stop people from believing it? Obviously not, since it is still so widespread today, and its claims have become a part of many ideologies, from New Age to QAnon, and the link between them. And of course, Hitler praised the protocols and even used them in his early speeches. They played a key part in Nazi propaganda. Multiple governments issued reports that the protocols were fiction, but of course, people didn't believe them. If you believe that there are elites controlling the world, then you believe that the governments are a part of that conspiracy. So are you going to believe the government? No. And this is the problem, right? And people know what they're doing when they're spreading this that because they know that just seeding that distrust can spread so far. So, coming back to the John Birch Society, the John Birch Society made claims of elitist plots and was the foundation of the fantasies followed even today, including the belief in the Illuminati, which gained traction in the 60s and 70s. These theories have popped up through major events in US history, including 9/11, the Boston bombings, and countless mass shootings. I'm sure you've heard the idea that it was all created by the elites as false flag events to put fear into the public so they can control them, right? It's always them or us. And I can say I was appalled by these theories, as somebody who was at the Boston bombings, to see them, on YouTube and across social media, people saying that it was all a plan. They were even went so far as to say that people I know and who are now like family to me who were injured, and they would post countless videos of these people on the internet saying that they were paid actors, and these people had their lives taken away. They, those people that died, the people who lost limbs, the people who were injured, the people who were just there and experienced it, had their lives changed that day. They say the same thing about 9/11. Horrific. They say the same thing about mass shootings. And I have a theory on this, but I'm going to get to it at the end. So, the let's talk about the protocols a little bit more, because the protocols are even part of textbooks in Arab and Islamic and in the Arab and Islamic world. And they're presented as fact. Now, let's note that there are also plenty of conspiracy fantasies about Arab and Islamic people. So everybody kind of has their own racism or religious conflict, and so these protocols, and actually an Islamic conspiracy fantasy, was the motivation of an attack in Norway in 2011 by a Norwegian who killed 77 people. And the protocols were connected to as a piece of motivation, and all these ideas of the elites and Jewish people were part of the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting, those who committed the El Paso mall shooting, the Poway synagogue shooting, the Christchurch mosque shooting, and the Oslo mosque shooting. And this is all connected to the concepts perpetuated in the protocols. And so let's talk about this a little bit more. The idea that, there's a big one with like the Rothschild family, George Soros, these are rooted in, like I said, discrediting and demonizing the Jewish people. And what is the worst thing you can think of? Like, everybody always talks about, like, if adults are, actually, let's talk about it in terms of COVID. There were all the people who were kind of COVID denialists, and even people who weren't, that it was like, well, it doesn't really affect kids. As if it doesn't affect kids, then kids are the most important, right? If it impacted kids in a great way, then maybe it'd be different, right? And so the worst thing that a lot of us can think of is something bad happening to children. And so, what could be worse than drinking the blood of children, stealing children, drinking their blood, and killing them? There's really not much worse you can really think of, right? So they have to use that. They have to use something that is so bad that will really get people, that will be so horrifying that people say, if this is true, this is really awful. And then that leads them down a rabbit hole, especially when there's an entire book based on it. And there's always a bit of truth that they find. Yes, the people that they originally would name as those families or people, they did have money. They did have some kind of power, but that doesn't mean that they were using that power for quote unquote evil. And so they use bits of truth, and usually very tiny bits of truth, to pull people in. And then they use scary, really scary, horrifying rhetoric and stories, such as consuming children's blood, to hook people. And you might think, if you're listening to this, then you're probably a person who is like, oh my God, how could somebody ever do that? There's obviously a lot of people out there who are willing to do it. And this is where you actually will see, and we're going to talk about this in at another time, but there is a lot of correlation and connection between Christian beliefs and New Age spirituality. And you can see, like I said, originally it wasn't just consuming children's blood. It was specifically Christian children's blood. Now it's grown, right? Now it's any child, I think. And there's somebody who lately on TikTok, this woman who has been sharing videos. I've been paying attention to her for a while, and she's shared pretty awful videos, saying her, of course, the word quantum is in her name, but I can't remember her name off the top of my head. But she has been sharing for a while videos basically claiming that mental health disorders are actually just a higher consciousness, and almost encouraging people to not get help for them, because if they don't get help, they can be in their true self, their higher consciousness, right? And she even went so far as to say, through all of this Kanye stuff, that he is Jesus, just as she is Jesus, because apparently we're all Jesus. And she said that he doesn't have a mental health problem, that's just his higher consciousness, and he is here to speak against those that are trying to control us. And she said a few other things that made it very obvious that she meant Jewish people. And so still to this day, these claims in these communities, even though they've gotten a little broader, they've included Democrats, they've included, any children in these conspiracy fantasies, it is still incredibly anti Semitic. And if you really pay attention, if you start to really look at these people and the things that they're saying, you can see the way that comes out. So I'm not going to get too into this one, but I'm just going to introduce it because we're going to go deep into this on the next episode and some of the people involved in spreading this. So somebody who is one of the people that really spread this elites conspiracy fantasy is David Icke. You may or may not have heard of him. He is from the UK. I always thought he was kind of creepy. I had friends that would watch some of his stuff years ago. And I knew that he spread this kind of rhetoric. And he says that an influx of non-European, which is mostly Muslim, migrants to Europe is being organized by George Soros, who again is a Jewish person, a very rich Jewish person, on the orders of the Rothschild family, famous for both being Jewish and for their association with banking, right? We've talked, as I said before, it involves, the elites are manipulating the economy, right? And he says that the reason for that is the intention of rendering Europe more susceptible to control. So same rhetoric. There are elite people who are trying to take control. And if you really read this, because what happens in the US, the rhetoric is around Mexicans coming over the border. And in Europe, if it's the Muslims coming into Europe and these Jewish elites are bringing them in, same with the US, these Jewish elites are allowing them in, right? And we know not just Jewish, but Democrats as well. Then the underlying point here for them is that somebody is trying to take control of and oppress white people. So all of this is so deeply anti-Semitic, racist. David Icke takes it further by saying that these elites are shape-shifting reptilians, which are from another planet, and they have been, living on Earth as different people for a really long time, and that they are evil and they're trying to control us and all of this stuff. So we're going to get more into him and his conspiracy fantasies and this concept around the reptilians, because we hear that. If you've been in the spiritual circles, you've heard that a lot. If you have paid attention, I have this, obviously I have interest in this stuff, but I have always been into psychology. So I shouldn't say that, but I was very intrigued by the QAnon movement. And so I've always paid attention to it. And, they talk about the same thing. The elites are reptilians. So this is connected to both. And that's why you see a lot of New Age people talking the same as you would people on the far right and in like QAnon. So that's it for today. But stay tuned because next week I'm going to go deep into David Icke and some other people as well and talk about this conspiracy fantasy of the reptilians and how it connects to everything else I just talked about. Stay tuned and thanks for listening.